Thanks for tuning in to the Football Talk Squadron. I'm Dutch, and this is our recap of Week 6 and looking into Week 7 for college football. We had a lot of great games this past weekend, but before we dive into that, we'll get into Guess the Player. So the first Guess the Player, this player went to two different schools, and that will be the major hint of it. You'll probably get it from just the schools along. Schools were Washington and then BYU, and the team is the LA Rams. Now, I bring this guy up because in college, yes, had a good career. I don't think anyone envisioned him having the type of season that he's having right now, which is your second big hint. And then the third big hint is he's a rookie. If you haven't got it, go ahead and pause if you want more time. But the answer is Puka Nacua for the LA Rams. You talk about a guy that came out of two really good systems in terms of throwing the football. I know that BYU can be considered a running team. They usually have a good running back. Tyler Algier with the Falcons is one of them. However, they are still that traditional West Coast. They're going to sling it in order to keep up with teams out west. Now that they're going to the Big 12, they'll probably be even more of a throwing team just in order to keep track with the offenses that come out of the Big 12. But he's a big-name player with the NFL this year. I think a lot of people forget where he actually graduated, which was BYU. Also went to Washington, but a good way to start the day. The second guy, which I think is interesting, is he's a TV announcer. You probably see him all the time on Fox for the NFL, is Steelers quarterback Terry Bradshaw. Where did he go to school? So it is not a Power 5 school. It's a school that the second big hint is, if you ever watch the show Duck Dynasty, it's where the head guy off of that show, he went to school, and he actually knew Terry Bradshaw because he was a quarterback as well and started ahead of Terry before Terry got there. This is a Southern school. However, like I said, not Pac-5 or Power 5. If you need a little bit more time, go ahead and pause. The answer to this question is Louisiana Tech. Now, Louisiana Tech hasn't produced a ton of players. Terry's one of them. Terry, the big notoriety to him is number 1 overall pick by the Steelers. And when you look at when the Steelers have had a top 5 pick, the Steelers haven't had a top 5 pick since Bradshaw in the 70s. That's how good the Steelers have been. But they pick him. They put guys around him. Had an amazing draft in 1974 where they selected 5 Hall of Famers. So they selected 4 in the draft with Mike Webster, John Stallworth, Lynn Swann, and Jack Ham. And then they picked up a unsigned or undrafted guy, Donnie Shell, and all 5 of those guys ended up in the Hall of Fame. So they were able to build that defense. You get Terry Bradshaw, 2 of the greatest receivers who have ever lived for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Lynn Swann and John Stallworth. They go on to win 4 Super Bowls with Bradshaw. Chuck Noll, you look at all the Hall of Famers that they produce out of there. Tremendous pick. He didn't start off great in Pittsburgh, threw a lot of picks, but became a Hall of Fame quarterback, winning those Super Bowls, forever a Steelers legend. But a lot of people don't know with the Louisiana Tech. Speaking of that, a smaller school, that's sort of the bigger thing that's coming out of college football right now, is there's nothing that right now shows any type of signs that anyone outside of the Power 5 is going to the CFP, which is why this episode is going to focus. I'm going to start with taking a look at the conferences themselves and which conference I think has the best chance of getting into the CFP. We'll talk about those individual teams out of those conferences, sort of look at what happened last week, what's happening in the future weeks, and we'll pack it all together. For me, if we're going to start it off as which conference has the best chance of making it, it's the Big 12, and here's why. Oklahoma got their statement win, which was over Texas. Yes, Texas beat Bama. That helps Oklahoma's resume because Oklahoma plays no one else for the rest of the year. In fact, the only team that could probably challenge Oklahoma out, on paper is at the end of the year, if Texas continues to win out, they'll meet again in the Big 12 championship. That's it. Oklahoma, on paper, doesn't play anyone else for the rest of the year ranked in the top 25. When you take a look at Oklahoma's schedule, you would say Oklahoma has the best chance. It's going to be difficult if Texas is there again to beat them again. It's always harder to beat a team the second time. However, this is just my opinion. I think Texas loses again. Does that change anything in terms of them facing Oklahoma again? I don't think so. The Big 12 is pretty terrible this year, to be quite honest. However, the thing about it is if Texas goes into the Big 12 championship against Oklahoma, only losing to Oklahoma, then everything's still on the table possibly, just depending on how the rest of the season works out. But just because they'd be playing an undefeated Oklahoma, a one-loss Texas, the winner is going to be the Big 12 champion. Compared to all the other schools, I would argue that whoever wins that game gets in. That's just my opinion, but that's why I have the Big 12 as the number one conference. Followed by Georgia. Now, you sit back and you go, well, why does Georgia not have the easiest road to get into the SEC or to get into the CFP? They don't play anyone. And that really is the answer of they don't play anyone. The best hope for Georgia in terms of improving their schedule is that Bama wins out. If Bama wins out and they play Bama in the SEC championship, by that point, Bama is for sure a top 10 team just based upon how many of the top 10 teams have to play one another throughout the rest of the year. It'd be a statement win for Georgia and would help push them over the top by being undefeated against Bama. However, if they don't play Bama, or even if they do, if they don't play a one-loss Bama, if they're playing even Bama with two losses or whoever it may be, and it's not that top 10 matchup, the thing that Georgia has going against it is if you take a look at the rest of the conferences, let's say Florida State goes undefeated. Let's say either Oregon, Washington, or USC goes undefeated. Oklahoma goes undefeated. And then one of the top three out of the Big Ten, which is Penn State, Michigan, or Ohio State, goes undefeated. If each of those four conferences go undefeated, in my opinion, Georgia's left out, and it's because of schedule. Each one of those teams, Florida State's had to play LSU. They've had to play Clemson. They've had to play bigger teams. Yes, I get that now that schedule doesn't look as great, but compared to Georgia's and who Georgia's going to have to play for the rest of the year, it's not a comparison. Florida State's had the harder schedule. Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, they're going to have to play one another. Each of those two matchups is going to be a better win than compared to Georgia. Oklahoma being undefeated and beating Texas is huge in terms of going past Georgia. They have a top 10 win. Georgia won't have that for the rest of the year. There's no one on the schedule that's going to reach that top 10 status outside of Alabama in the SEC championship. And then for Oregon, Washington, or USC, they're going to have to play one another. All of those teams are top 10. If someone can escape from the Pac-12 unscathed without a loss, they're in. That's, to me, why Georgia has the second easiest road. I still think it's an incredibly easy road. Georgia just really needs to win out because, let's be honest, the likelihood that what I just said happens, which is the other four conferences produce an undefeated champion, it's never happened. You've never had in the CFP 5 Power 5 teams all undefeated. Hasn't happened. We've always had a one loss. We've always, even last year with the 2-loss Alabama, that you've talked about putting in over other teams because no one's been able to run the gauntlet undefeated from each of the Power 5 conferences. That's why Georgia's number 2. When you take a look at Georgia and the SEC, the only other school, and I brought them up earlier, is Alabama in terms of reaching the CFP. You've got LSU with 2 losses. You have other schools with multiple losses on their schedule. No one really has that schedule. Do I think that there's some teams that play that can affect the CFP? 100%. You know, you take a look at this week's upcoming games. You got Tennessee playing Texas A&M. You got LSU playing Auburn. Alabama playing Arkansas. All these teams, if they continue to play well and win, it has a better chance of affecting things down the road. And this is what I mean by that. If Tennessee can continue to win out and plays Georgia at home with only one loss, which is against Florida, if they beat Georgia, they control their own destiny in the East. Georgia would need Tennessee to lose one more game to an SEC opponent in order to be able to advance. Now you sit back and say, well, if Tennessee beats Georgia but loses to Alabama, one of those two things, that type of path happens and Georgia can still advance. However, that hurts Georgia's chances as we go down the road. But you look at LSU, that's a great test for Bama. If LSU loses another game where it's pretty much like, hey, there's no way that we can make the SEC championship, I think LSU lays down as the season goes on. You see it year after year with Bama, typically in bowl games, that if they can't get to the CFP, usually whoever they play in the bowl game, you want to take the spread on that team, if not call them for an outright win. I can think back to Oklahoma, West Virginia, Utah. There's numerous times that Bama hasn't made either the BCS championship or the CFP that they go in, meet someone that Bama's just not there mentally. Last year, they showed up versus Kansas State, surprisingly. They didn't look it great in the first half, but then they showed up in the second half and was able to win that game. But from the standpoint of the SEC, in my opinion, it's really between Georgia and Alabama, and I really don't like Alabama in terms of what they're doing right now. Yes, they have a great win at Texas A&M. They found a way to win the game. I honestly didn't think it was going to go that way. I know I picked them, but it was just one of those ones that you didn't have a good feeling about. Alabama's offensive line still gave up 5 first-half sacks. You're not going to win many football games, or even more so any type of playoff contention or national championship with an offensive line playing that bad. The good news for Alabama is their defense. In the second half against Ole Miss, Texas A&M, and South Florida, gave up 0 points to South Florida and only 3 to Ole Miss and Texas A&M. The defense is playing at a playoff caliber. Can the offense get there? If the offense can continue to build, I like Alabama going forward. Their whole question, yes, it's Jalen Milroe. He played well and beat Texas A&M. He still made some bad mistakes. If their offensive line can't control the line of scrimmage, they're going to eventually lose a game. That's what's going to happen. Their offensive line, if they can get better, then they can go forward. But until that happens, it's really a one-team race in the SEC, with it being Georgia. The next conference that I think has the best chance of getting in is the Pac-12. And this is why I say it. You have a huge game this week with Washington and Oregon, and I think that this game alone sets the tone for the rest of the Pac-12. USC's defense is terrible, and the reason I immediately jumped to USC is that's really the next biggest threat in terms of ranking. There are still great teams out there. You got Washington State, Oregon State. You have, and it shows even Arizona can battle teams, and Arizona State can put up good numbers. Teams have the ability to scare the other teams and knock one another off. Whoever wins the Washington-Oregon game really starts to control their own destiny in terms of making the CFP and making a statement. If they can go to the Pac-12, Pac-12 is the exact same as the Big 12. You're not having different divisions play one another. You're having the top 2 teams in the Pac-12 face one another. It'll be interesting to see what happens because those schools all play one another throughout the week. Following weeks, you got Washington has to play USC, same with Oregon. One of those teams is going to come out, I would say, on the better end. I don't think it's USC because of their defense. I think that Oregon and Washington are going to meet up again in the Pac-12 championship. Whoever wins this game has the roadmap to getting in. However, it would be hard to deny that if USC, let's say Oregon loses to Washington this weekend, they're a 3-point underdog. Washington goes undefeated. It's a close game to Oregon this week. They go to the Pac-12 championship, and it's a close game again, and Oregon wins. It's going to be hard to decide who's representing the Pac-12. I would argue that it's going to be Oregon, but it'd be hard to leave Washington out depending on what happens for the rest of the season. When you take a look at the rest of the Pac-12 teams, a lot of talent around them, but it's just a matter of what happens going forward. Notre Dame right now is a 3-point favorite over USC, which is surprising because of how bad that Notre Dame's offense has played the past few weeks, especially against better opponents. And you sort of saw it coming against Ohio State. You knew that was going to be a bully match, but then they struggle against Duke, find a way to win at the end, and then don't look good at all against Louisville. Louisville's an undefeated team out of the ACC, but I don't think anyone would sit back and say, hey, Louisville, Ohio State are the same type of opponent. If you put Louisville and Ohio State on the same field, I think Vegas would probably put Ohio State at least a double digit. I'd say at least 14, if not getting into the 20-point favorite, just because of the talent difference on either side of the football. Notre Dame has a huge game this week against USC. It will be interesting to see how well Notre Dame's defense plays against USC's offense. We know that Notre Dame's offense should look good against USC's defense because USC's defense can't stop anyone. Can it be USC's first loss? Yes. I'm going to have the Trojans pulling the upset just because I think that Notre Dame losing last week against USC, how they've looked since the Ohio State loss, it doesn't bode well for me looking forward to say, hey, I think Notre Dame's going to pull it together and find a way in order to win these games. I'm going to give the nod to USC, which is going to set up a more impactful matchup as the season goes on when USC has to meet Oregon and Washington. It matters more when USC's undefeated. That's just how I see it going, but we'll see how it plays out. And then the last conference is the ACC, which is Florida State. The next conference, fourth easiest road is the ACC with Florida State. You've got UNC, and then the last undefeated team is Louisville. From the ACC, the only reason I say it's the fourth easiest schedule is because Florida State it's still that type of team that they're dealing with a lot of injuries. I think that they came out, they really showed a great performance against Virginia Tech, covered the spread, or didn't cover the spread, but still looked really good. Florida State's that type of team dealing with injuries on the offensive line. It's a matter of, can they consistently show up? You saw them against Boston College the week before they played Clemson. Didn't look great. Clemson had a chance to win the game, couldn't execute. Florida State found a way to win, won the game. They look better against Virginia Tech. Can they keep that rolling? Because they're either going to play Louisville or UNC in the ACC championship. I sit back and say Florida State shouldn't lose. Miami loses in the dumbest way possible, which what I would have sort of predicted to be their trap game. And if Miami had went into that game undefeated, I'd give way more of an edge to Miami playing Florida State. But Miami losing by not taking a knee, you sort of sit back and go, I think that's going to sort of doom Miami going forward. That's just hypothetical. Now, for the other major hypothetical is we talked about this a few weeks ago. I really think that this loss opens the door for what I think is the perfect matchup for Miami in terms of a head coach, which is Deion Sanders. There's no more of a school that Deion would have a more impactful impact on than Miami. When you take a look at how Deion runs a program, the level of recruits he's able to pull in, him going to a Power 5 school with the brand name of Miami would put Miami, in my opinion, back into the glory days. Will that happen? I think so, mainly because I think that as soon as his son leaves, both of his sons leave Colorado, Deion's out of there. Deion is building a case that he should be a Power 5 head coach at a bigger name school in terms of a Miami or even a Florida State. I know that's his own. I don't see Florida State happening. That's why I think Miami's the perfect matchup. I think that Cristobal losing this game as he did, just the way things have gone in Miami, I think that we are starting to see the road be paved for this happening. That's my prediction. That's what happens. If it happens, then I'll easily clip this episode and say, hey, I called it. Then the last team, best chance to make it, is the Big Ten. Why are they the last? It is because of the difficult of schools winning all three matchups. Penn State especially, they typically lose one, win the other. Ohio State, you look at their quarterback play, it hasn't been to the level that you would like to see out of Ohio State based upon the weapons they have on offense. Then you have Michigan, which has won games, and no game has ever really been close. However, you don't see the consistency that you would like to see out of Michigan going forward. I think Michigan's the best team out of those three. It will be interesting to see what happens in the Penn State-Ohio State game, just because I think it will define the season as it goes more forward if Penn State wins. If Penn State wins and has an all-white evening game against Michigan in Beaver Stadium, you sit back and go, I would be hard-pressed to not give an advantage to Penn State because of the atmosphere, because of the knowing that if you win this game, you're going to represent the Big Ten in the Big Ten championship, play an absolute terrible team from the other division, and your road to the CFP is set in stone. If that happens. Michigan, on the other hand, I think has the best chance just because they play Ohio State at home. Yes, they have to go to Penn State, but if Penn State was to lose to Ohio State, I think that Michigan goes into Penn State and wins convincingly. I think they get Ohio State at home. I think their defense is too much for Ohio State. It's shown up the last 2 years that Ohio State can't be physical enough with Michigan, especially their offensive line against Michigan's defense. It hasn't been there the last few years. I don't see that changing, especially with a quarterback that's not playing to the level that C.J. Stroud was playing the last year and then Fields the year before that. Those are the type of matchups that I'm seeing. I'd give the nod to Michigan right now. So, just to take a quick recap, when you take a look at the SEC, I have Georgia. Big 12, I got Oklahoma. Big 10, I've got Michigan. ACC, I've got Florida State. And then out of the Pac-12, I personally think it's Washington just because of how Washington's playing. However, it is a legitimate coin flip between them and Oregon. I think Oregon's defense could surprise Washington. The issue is that Washington's quarterback Penix is playing out of his mind. If it wasn't for Caleb Williams putting up his stats and also being the returning Heisman winner, I would say Penix is number one right now to win the Heisman this year. But Caleb Williams is putting up ungodly stats, even when you compare it to last year when he won the Heisman. Those are sort of the bigger matchups. That's what's happened this week. The biggest matchup, the game of the week, is Oregon-Washington. That game is really going to shape, in my opinion, the college football playoff race just because the Pac-12 is the best conference. They have the most teams that could qualify to win. We'll see how it goes. But that's sort of where college football is right now. We're starting to learn a lot more about teams. We'll see how it shakes out every week from here on out. Great matchups. You got Oregon, Washington this week. You've got Penn State, Ohio State next weekend. You're going to have Alabama playing Tennessee. You're going to have Tennessee playing Georgia. The matchups keep getting better as we go on. It's exciting to see, but we'll see how it shakes out. That's sort of where it is right now with college football. Do appreciate you guys turning in. Follow us and subscribe on Instagram and TikTok. And then for our other podcasts and media channels, follow us on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. Check out our website, footballtalksquadron.com. Thanks for tuning in. Time to pull chalks. We'll see you next week.